The silence in Abigail Davidson's homeroom class was broken only by the steady tick of the wall clock and the occasional rustle of paper as the children worked on their arithmetic. She glanced up from her desk to survey the room of 12 students, her eyes inevitably drawn to the small figure in the back corner, a girl with copper-colored braids and eyes that hadn't sparkled in nearly 8 months. Dalia Kincaid sat perfectly still, her pencil poised above her slate, but making no marks. The 10-year-old daughter of Abel Kincaid, one of the most respected ranchers in the territory, hadn't spoken a single word since the day her mother Margaret was laid to rest, after a swift and merciless fever took her life the previous autumn. Abigail checked the clock 11:45. Soon it would be noon, and while the other children would rush outside to eat their packed lunches and play in the schoolyard of Willow Creek, Colorado, she would do what she had done every school day for the past 7 months. She would sit with Dalia and read to her. It had started as an act of desperation in December of 1876, when Abigail realized the child wasn't speaking to anyone, not even her father. The school board had suggested the girl might need specialized care, but Abigail, just 22, and in her first year of teaching, had begged for time. "Let me try," she had insisted. "She's listening, even if she's not speaking." The noon bell rang, and children scrambled for the door, eager for fresh air after a morning of lessons. Dalia remained seated, her eyes fixed on the window. "Would you like to eat outside today, Dalia?" Abigail asked, knowing she wouldn't receive a verbal response. The girl simply shook her head, a minute movement that Abigail had learned to watch for. Abigail retrieved her worn copy of Little Women from her desk drawer. They were halfway through now, and though Dalia never commented on the story, Abigail had noticed how the girl's eyes would follow the words, how her small hands would sometimes clench during dramatic moments. "Where did we leave off?" Abigail asked softly, settling into the desk beside Dalia's. She opened to the marked page. Ah, yes. Jo had just received a letter about her manuscript. As Abigail read, her gentle voice filling the quiet classroom, she didn't notice the tall figure that paused in the doorway, hat in hand. Abel Kincaid watched silently, his weathered face unreadable as the young schoolteacher read to his daughter. He hadn't planned to arrive at noon. He'd come to talk to Miss Davidson about Dalia's progress, or lack thereof. The doctor in Denver had suggested an institution might be the best place for a child who refused to speak, and though the very thought tore at Abel's heart, he was at his wit's end. But seeing them like this, the pretty young teacher leaning close to his daughter, her voice animated as she read, and Dalia's face showing more emotion than he'd seen in months, made him reconsider. He stepped back quietly, deciding his conversation with Miss Davidson could wait. Outside, Abel leaned against the schoolhouse wall, turning his hat in his hands. At 34, he'd already lived enough for 2 lifetimes. He'd driven cattle from Texas to Colorado, built a ranch from nothing but his own 2 hands and determination, found a woman who loved him despite his rough edges, and then lost her to illness, leaving him with a daughter he didn't know how to reach. And now this school teacher, this educated Eastern woman who spoke so properly and moved with such grace, was doing what he couldn't. She was finding a way to connect with Dalia. When the children began filtering back into the schoolhouse an hour later, Abel straightened and dusted off his clothes. He'd return after school let out. He needed to thank Miss Davidson properly for her kindness toward Dalia, and perhaps ask her advice about this suggestion of an institution. The afternoon dragged by for Abigail. Her mind kept drifting to Dalia, wondering what thoughts swirled behind those solemn eyes. The girl was bright, her written work proved that, but the silence was concerning. Most children processed grief differently than adults. Abigail knew that from her training at the normal school in Boston. But Dalia's complete withdrawal was extreme. When the final bell rang, Abigail watched as Dalia methodically packed her slate and books into her small satchel. Usually, the girl would walk home alone. The Kincaid ranch was only a mile from town, but today, Abigail had a feeling she should accompany her. "Dalia," she said gently, "would you mind if I walked with you today? I'd like to speak with your father." The girl paused, then gave a small nod. It was the most communication Abigail had received outside their reading sessions. As they stepped out into the late April sunshine, Abigail was surprised to see Abel Kincaid himself waiting by the hitching post, his tall frame unmistakable among the mothers who had come to collect their younger children. "Mr. Kincaid," Abigail said, her voice betraying her surprise. "I was just about to walk Dalia home to speak with you." Abel nodded, his eyes moving from the teacher to his daughter. "Dalia, honey, would you mind waiting by the wagon for a moment? I need to speak with Miss Davidson." Dalia looked between the two adults, then walked obediently to the wagon, climbing up to sit on the bench seat. "Miss Davidson," Abel began, his deep voice low, "I wanted to thank you for what you're doing for my daughter, reading to her every day like that. It's more than anyone else has done." Abigail felt a flush creep up her neck. "It's nothing, Mr. Kincaid. Any teacher would do the same." "No, they wouldn't," he replied firmly. "The last teacher suggested we stop bringing her to school entirely until she was normal again." His jaw tightened at the memory. "That's absurd," Abigail said, unable to hide her indignation. "Dalia is a brilliant child. Her written work is exceptional, and she understands everything being taught. She simply chooses not to speak." Abel's expression softened slightly. "That's why I'm here, Miss Davidson. I received a letter from a doctor in Denver. He thinks Dalia should be placed in a special institution for children with difficulties." The words clearly pained him. "I wanted your opinion before I made any decisions." Abigail felt her heart constrict. "An institution? Mr. Kincaid, that's completely unnecessary. Dalia is making progress, even if it's slow. She responds to me in her own way. She's still grieving her mother, but with time and patience." "Time and patience," Abel repeated, running a hand through his dark hair. "Those are luxuries for men with options, Miss Davidson. I'm a rancher with a spring calving season approaching, and a child who won't speak to me or anyone else. I don't know what to do for her anymore." Abigail glanced at Dalia, who was watching them intently from the wagon. "Give me more time with her," she said suddenly. "Not just at school. Perhaps I could come to the ranch on weekends, bring books, try different approaches." Abel looked at her with surprise. "You'd do that?" "Of course," Abigail said, without hesitation. "Dalia deserves every chance to heal in a familiar environment, surrounded by people who care about her. An institution should be the absolute last resort, and I don't believe we're anywhere near that point." For the first time, Abel Kincaid smiled, and Abigail was struck by how it transformed his face, softening the hard lines of worry that had been etched there. "I'd be grateful for your help, Miss Davidson," he said. "Would Saturday be too soon for your first visit?" "Saturday would be perfect," Abigail replied, returning his smile. "And please, call me Abigail." "Only if you'll call me Abel," he responded. "Miss Davidson makes me feel like I'm back in school myself, about to be scolded for pulling some poor girl's braids." Abigail laughed, a bright sound that carried across the schoolyard. "I can't imagine you pulling braids, Mr. Kincaid, Abel." "You'd be surprised," he said with a wink, then turned serious again. "Thank you, Abigail, for everything you're doing for Dalia." As Abel walked back to the wagon and helped Dalia adjust her satchel, Abigail felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. She told herself it was simply relief at having postponed the institution discussion. But there was something about Abel Kincaid's smile that lingered in her mind as she watched the wagon disappear down the dusty road. Saturday dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp spring air that promised a warm afternoon. Abigail dressed carefully in a serviceable blue skirt and white shirtwaist, packing a basket with the books she'd selected for Dalia, along with some fresh biscuits she'd baked that morning. It was presumptuous to bring food to a host's home, perhaps, but she'd heard from town gossip that while Abel Kincaid was a skilled rancher, domestic arts were not his forte. The town's livery stable owner, Mr. Peterson, had agreed to loan her a gentle mare for the day. Abigail was a competent rider, necessary for a schoolteacher who might need to visit far-flung students during illness or bad weather, but she preferred quiet horses without too much spirit. The ride to the Kincaid Ranch took her through rolling grasslands dotted with spring wildflowers. The Rocky Mountains loomed in the distance, still snow-capped even as the valley greened with new life. Abigail breathed deeply, enjoying the freedom of being away from town, if only for a day. The ranch came into view as she crested a small hill, a large two-story log house with a wide porch, a barn bigger than many she'd seen, and various outbuildings. Several corrals contained horses in various stages of training. And beyond them, she could see cattle grazing on the lush spring grass. As she approached the main house, a ranch hand spotted her and called out. Moments later, Abel emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth. He waved in greeting, and Abigail felt that strange flutter again. "You made it," he said as she reined in her horse. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd changed your mind." "Not at all," Abigail replied, accepting his help to dismount. "It's a beautiful ride from town." Abel nodded, taking the reins of her horse. "One of the reasons I chose this land. No matter how hard the work gets, the view makes it worthwhile." He glanced at the house. "Dalia's inside. She's been watching the road all morning, though she tried to pretend she wasn't." "That's encouraging," Abigail said, collecting her basket. "It means she was looking forward to the visit." "Or dreading it," Abel said with a wry smile. "Hard to tell with her these days." Abigail touched his arm impulsively. "She's still in there, Abel. The Dalia you knew before. We just need to find the right way to reach her." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then met her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I hope you're right." The moment was broken by the sound of the front door opening. Dalia stood on the porch, watching them with those solemn eyes that seemed to hold all the sorrow in the world. "Hello, Dalia," Abigail called cheerfully, removing her hand from Abel's arm and walking toward the house. "I've brought some books I thought you might enjoy." Dalia didn't smile, but she stepped aside to let Abigail enter the house. Abel followed, instructing the ranch hand to see to Abigail's horse. The interior of the Kincaid home was surprisingly comfortable. Abigail had expected a bachelor rancher's Spartan quarters, but the large main room was filled with well-made furniture, colorful hand-woven rugs, and shelves lined with books. A piano stood in one corner, a thin layer of dust suggesting it hadn't been played in some time. "Your home is lovely," Abigail said, setting her basket on a large oak table. "Margaret's doing," Abel replied quietly. She had a gift for making any place feel like home. He glanced at Dalia, who was standing by the window, watching them. "We haven't changed much since last fall." Abigail nodded, understanding the unspoken grief that hung in the air. "Sometimes familiarity is comforting," she said. Then, turning to Dalia, she added brightly, "I brought Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Have you read it before?" Dalia shook her head, her interest visibly piqued despite her continued silence. "Wonderful. Then we have an adventure ahead of us." Abigail removed the book from her basket, along with the wrapped biscuits. "And I brought some biscuits, though I'm afraid they may have gotten a bit crushed during the ride." "You didn't need to bring anything," Abel said, though he eyed the biscuits with undisguised interest. Abigail laughed. "Consider it payment for letting me impose on your Saturday." "It's hardly an imposition," he replied. And there was that smile again, the one that transformed his face and made Abigail's heart beat just a little faster. They settled into a pattern that day. Abigail read to Dalia on the porch swing while Abel worked around the ranch, coming and going, sometimes listening for a few minutes before returning to his chores. Dalia seemed more relaxed here than at school, occasionally pointing to illustrations in the book or nodding in response to Abigail's questions about the story. After lunch, a simple but hearty affair of beans, biscuits, both Abigail's and some that Abel had made, which were decidedly more dense. And apple preserves. Abel suggested a walk to show Abigail some of the ranch. "Would you like that, Dalia?" he asked his daughter, who had been watching a robin building a nest in the eaves of the porch. To both adults' surprise, Dalia nodded eagerly and went to fetch her shawl without being asked. "That's the most enthusiasm I've seen from her in months," Abel murmured to Abigail as they waited by the door. "She feels safe here," Abigail replied, "and she's comfortable with you, even if she's not speaking yet." Abel's expression clouded. "I'm not so sure about that. Sometimes I think she blames me for not saving her mother." "Children don't think that way," Abigail assured him. "Dalia knows you would have done anything to save Margaret if you could have." "Would I, though?" Abel said so quietly Abigail almost didn't hear him. "I was 2 days' ride away when Margaret fell ill, buying cattle in Wyoming. If I'd been here..." Abigail's heart ached for him. You can't blame yourself for that. You were providing for your family, doing what any good husband and father would do. Abel met her eyes, and the pain she saw there made her want to reach out to him. Before she could respond, Dalia returned, and the moment passed. The walk took them through meadows bursting with wildflowers, past a creek where Abel pointed out the beaver dam his ranch hands had been monitoring to prevent flooding, and finally to a small rise where a single oak tree stood sentinel. Beneath it was a simple wooden cross. Abigail realized with a start that this must be Margaret's grave. The location was beautiful, with a view of the entire valley and the mountains beyond. Dalia walked directly to the cross and knelt beside it, placing a wildflower she had picked along the way at its base. Abel stood a few paces back, his expression unreadable. Abigail hesitated, feeling like an intruder on a private moment. "I can wait by the creek," she offered softly. Abel shook his head. "Stay, please." He moved to stand beside his daughter, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. Dalia didn't pull away, but she remained focused on the cross, her small fingers tracing the letters carved into the wood. Margaret Ann Kincaid, beloved wife and mother. "We come here every Sunday after church," Abel explained quietly, "and sometimes during the week if Dalia wants to. It was Margaret's favorite spot on the ranch. She used to say she could see all the way to tomorrow from here." Abigail felt tears prick at her eyes. "It's beautiful," she said simply. They stood in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the whisper of the breeze through the grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Then, to Abigail's astonishment, Dalia rose, took her father's hand, and began to tug him back toward the house. Abel's surprise was evident, but he allowed himself to be led. Abigail followed, watching as Dalia marched determinedly across the meadow, still clutching her father's hand. Whatever had prompted this sudden action remained locked inside her, but it was the most initiative the child had shown since Abigail had known her. When they reached the house, Dalia went straight to a cabinet in the corner of the main room and opened it, revealing sheet music stacked neatly inside. She selected several pages and carried them to the piano, placing them on the stand before looking expectantly at Abigail. "Do you want me to play?" Abigail asked, surprised. Dalia nodded firmly. Abel cleared his throat. "Margaret played," he explained. "Every evening after supper. Dalia hasn't wanted the piano touched since... I'm not very accomplished," Abigail warned, settling onto the bench. "Just basic hymns and simple tunes from my school days." Dalia didn't seem discouraged. She pointed insistently at the sheet music, which Abigail now saw was a folk song called Barbara Allen. "This was your mother's music?" Abigail asked gently. Dalia nodded, her expression intense. Abigail began to play, her fingers stiff at first, but gradually finding the melody. It was a sad, sweet tune about unrequited love and death, perhaps not the most cheerful choice, but clearly significant to Dalia. As she played, Abigail became aware of Abel watching her, his expression softening in a way that made her feel both self-conscious and pleased. Dalia stood beside the piano, her eyes closed, swaying slightly to the music. When Abigail finished, there was a moment of complete silence. Then, to her utter amazement, Dalia spoke. "Mama sang that," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse but clear. "At night, when I couldn't sleep." Abel made a choked sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. He dropped to one knee beside his daughter. "Yes, honey, she did. She loved that song." Dalia looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in months. "I miss her, Papa." "I know, sweetheart," Abel said, gathering her into his arms. "I miss her too. Every single day." Abigail sat frozen at the piano, afraid to move or speak and break the spell of this moment. Tears slid silently down her cheeks as she watched father and daughter hold each other, finally sharing their grief instead of suffering separately. After a long moment, Dalia pulled back slightly and looked at Abigail. "Can you play another one?" "Of course," Abigail said, her voice thick with emotion. "Show me which one you'd like." Dalia selected another piece, and as Abigail played, the girl leaned against her father, who had settled into a chair beside the piano. The sun slanted through the windows, casting golden light across the room, and for the first time since entering the Kincaid home, Abigail felt the heavy shadow of grief begin to lift. By the time Abigail prepared to return to town, Dalia had spoken several complete sentences, though she was still reserved and quiet. The breakthrough, however, was undeniable. Abel walked Abigail to her horse, leaving Dalia inside with a promise to return quickly. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Abigail shook her head. "I didn't do anything, Abel. Dalia was ready to speak when she felt safe enough to do so. That's all." "It wasn't just that," he insisted. "It was you, your patience, your kindness, the way you read to her, treated her like she was still whole, even when the rest of us were treating her like she was broken." His words warmed Abigail more than they should have. Any good teacher would have done the same. "No," Abel said firmly. "What you did was extraordinary, and He paused, seeming to search for words. "I would be honored if you would consider continuing these visits, not just for Dalia's sake, though God knows she benefits from your presence, but I've enjoyed your company as well." Abigail felt her cheeks flush. "I would like that very much," she replied honestly. Abel's relief was palpable. "Perhaps next Saturday, I could show you more of the ranch. Dalia might even be willing to ride out with us if she continues to improve." "Next Saturday it is," Abigail agreed, accepting his help to mount her horse. As she rode back toward town, Abigail found herself smiling. The day had been a success beyond her wildest hopes, but it wasn't just Dalia's breakthrough that had her spirits soaring. There was something about Abel Kincaid, his strength, his vulnerability, his fierce love for his daughter, that touched Abigail in a way she hadn't expected. It was too soon, she knew that. Abel was still grieving his wife, and Abigail had come to help Dalia, not to develop feelings for her father. But as the silhouette of Willow Creek appeared on the horizon, Abigail couldn't deny the flutter of anticipation she felt at the thought of returning to the Kincaid ranch the following weekend. The next week passed in a blur for Abigail. At school, Dalia was transformed not completely back to the child she had been before her mother's death, perhaps, but speaking when called upon, even occasionally volunteering answers in class. The other children were initially startled by the change, but they quickly adapted, including Dalia in their games at recess for the first time in months. Abigail continued their noon readings, but now Dalia would respond with questions or observations about the story. On Thursday, the girl even laughed aloud at a particularly humorous passage, a sound so unexpected that Abigail nearly dropped the book in surprise. By Friday afternoon, Abigail found herself watching the clock, eager for the school day to end so Saturday could arrive. She had prepared more carefully for this visit, selecting books she thought Dalia might enjoy, and practicing several new songs on the piano at the boarding house where she lived. Mrs. Hollister, the widowed owner of the boarding house, noticed Abigail's distraction at supper that evening. "You seem in fine spirits, Miss Davidson," she commented as she passed the bread. "Any particular reason?" Abigail felt her cheeks warm. "Dalia Kincaid has begun speaking again," she said, focusing on the professional aspect of her happiness. "It's remarkable progress." "So I've heard," Mrs. Hollister replied with a knowing smile. "And I've also heard you've been visiting the Kincaid ranch on weekends. Quite devoted to your students, sir, aren't you?" There was no malice in the older woman's tone, but Abigail was acutely aware of the other boarders listening to their conversation, two elderly sisters who taught piano lessons, and a middle-aged clerk from the mercantile. In a town as small as Willow Creek, any hint of impropriety could damage her reputation as a teacher. "Mr. Kincaid was concerned about his daughter's progress," Abigail explained carefully. "I offered to provide additional educational support outside of school hours." "Very commendable," Mrs. Hollister said, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by Abigail's professional explanation. "Abel Kincaid is one of the finest men in the county, you know. Been through a terrible ordeal with losing Margaret like that, and raising that child alone." "Yes, he's a very devoted father," Abigail agreed, desperate to change the subject. "Miss Pierce, have you heard from your niece in Denver recently?" The conversation turned to other topics, but Abigail remained unsettled. She hadn't considered how her visits to the Kincaid ranch might appear to others in town. She was genuinely concerned about Dalia's well-being, and her interest in Abel was, well, she wasn't entirely sure what it was, but she certainly hadn't intended for it to become fodder for town gossip. Saturday morning, Abigail rose early, too restless to sleep. She dressed in her riding skirt and a pretty blue blouse that brought out the color of her eyes, then immediately chided herself for the vanity. This was about Dalia, not about impressing Abel, yet when she arrived at the ranch to find Abel waiting for her, dressed in clean clothes with his dark hair still damp from washing, Abigail couldn't deny the leap her heart gave at the sight of him. "You're early," he said by way of greeting, a smile creasing his tanned face. "The morning was too beautiful to waste," she replied, dismounting without assistance this time. "Is Dalia ready for our adventure?" "More than ready," Abel confirmed. "She's been up since dawn, packing a picnic basket and selecting books to bring along. I haven't seen her this excited about anything in—" He stopped, his expression clouding briefly before he continued. "In a very long time?" Abigail nodded, understanding the unspoken comparison to the time before Margaret's death. It's wonderful to see her enthusiasm returning. As if summoned by their conversation, Dalia appeared on the porch, a small satchel clutched in her hands. "Miss Davidson," she called, her voice still slightly raspy but stronger than before. "I found Mama's book of poetry. Can we bring it?" "Of course," Abigail replied, walking toward the house. "I'd love to see it." The day unfolded like a gift. They rode across the ranch, Abel pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of how he'd acquired the land 10 years earlier, when it was little more than a scrubby patch of grass with a dilapidated cabin. Dalia, seated in front of her father on his big bay gelding, occasionally added details to his tales, or corrected his memory, making both adults laugh. They stopped for their picnic beside a small lake, where wildflowers grew in such profusion that Abigail exclaimed in delight. "It's like a garden planted by fairies," she said, earning a smile from Dalia. "Mama used to say the same thing," the girl said, and for once the mention of her mother didn't bring immediate sadness to her face. "She taught me all their names. That blue one is a columbine, and the purple ones are lupines, and those yellow ones are cinquefoil." "You have a good memory," Abigail praised her, spreading the blanket Abel had brought while he tethered the horses. "Papa says I get that from Mama too," Dalia replied, helping to arrange the food they had brought: cold chicken, biscuits, apple preserves, and a jar of lemonade. "Your mother must have been a remarkable woman," Abigail said carefully, aware that she was venturing into potentially sensitive territory. Dalia nodded solemnly. "She was beautiful and smart and could play the piano better than anyone. She taught me to read when I was only 4 years old." The girl paused, her expression growing contemplative. "Papa says you remind him of her sometimes, not in how you look, but in other ways." Abigail felt a flush creep up her neck. "Does he?" she asked, busying herself with arranging the food to avoid meeting Dalia's perceptive gaze. "Mm-hmm," Dalia confirmed. "He told Mr. Jenkins that you have the same kind of— what was it? Oh, quiet strength. That's what he said." Abel, returning from tethering the horses, caught the end of his daughter's comment and cleared his throat awkwardly. "Dalia, remember what we discussed about repeating private conversations?" "Sorry, Papa," Dalia said, though she didn't look particularly contrite. "But it wasn't like you were saying anything bad about Miss Davidson." "Even so," Abel said firmly, sitting down on the blanket and avoiding Abigail's eyes. "Some conversations aren't meant to be shared." Abigail, taking pity on his embarrassment, changed the subject. "This is a beautiful spot for a picnic. Do you come here often?" "Not as often as we should," Abel replied, clearly grateful for the redirection. "It's a bit out of the way from the main ranch operations, but it's peaceful." "Mama and I used to come here to pick flowers," Dalia volunteered. "She said it was our secret garden." A comfortable silence fell as they ate, broken only by the sounds of nature around them, birds calling, the gentle lapping of the lake against its shores, the occasional whisper of wind through the tall grass. Abigail found herself stealing glances at Abel, admiring the strong line of his jaw, the way the sunlight brought out auburn highlights in his dark hair. Once she caught him looking back, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. They both looked away quickly, but something had shifted between them, a recognition that couldn't be easily dismissed. After they had eaten, Dalia asked Abigail to read from the poetry book she had brought. It was a well-worn volume of Wordsworth, the pages marked with pressed flowers and handwritten notes in the margins. "These were your mother's annotations?" Abigail asked, running her fingers over the delicate script. Dalia nodded. She wrote in all her books. Papa said it used to drive him crazy, but now... She trailed off, glancing at her father. Now I'm grateful for it, Abel finished quietly. It's like having pieces of her thoughts still with us. Abigail read several poems, choosing ones that celebrated nature's beauty rather than those that dwelled on loss or grief. Dalia listened attentively, sometimes mouthing the words along with Abigail, suggesting she had heard these poems before. When Abigail paused after a particularly moving stanza, Abel spoke. Margaret used to read poetry to me in the evenings, he said, his voice soft with memory. I never had much schooling left home at 14 to work cattle drives, but she thought everyone should know beautiful words. She was right, Abigail agreed. Beautiful words help us make sense of the world, especially when it seems chaotic or cruel. Abel met her eyes, and she felt understood in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Here was a man who had known great love and devastating loss, who understood that life was precious and fleeting, who valued words not for their own sake, but for what they revealed about the human heart. The moment was broken by Dalia, who had wandered to the lake's edge to look for tadpoles. "Papa, Miss Davidson, come see what I found." They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the lake's shoreline, watching a family of ducks with their new ducklings, and identifying wildflowers. By the time they packed up to return to the ranch, the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains. As they rode back, Dalia grew quiet, fatigue evident in the droop of her shoulders. Abel shifted her more securely against his chest, and soon she was asleep, lulled by the horse's steady gait. "She hasn't napped in years," Abel commented softly to Abigail, who rode beside them. "Today has been good for her." "For all of us, I think," Abigail replied. She hesitated, then added, "Abel, I should tell you, there's been some talk in town about my visits to your ranch." His expression darkened. "What kind of talk?" "Nothing malicious," she assured him quickly. "Just questions about the propriety of a single woman visiting a widower's home, even if it is for the child's benefit." Abel was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight. "I hadn't considered that," he finally said. "Your reputation is important for your position as a teacher." "It is," Abigail agreed. "But Dalia's well-being is important too. I don't want to stop our visits." "Nor do I," Abel admitted. "Perhaps we could be more public about them. You could join us for Sunday services, have dinner with us afterward at the hotel dining room, where others can see it's all quite proper." Abigail considered this. "That might help," she agreed. "And perhaps we could invite Reverend Thomas to join us for dinner one Saturday at your ranch. His presence would certainly lend respectability to the arrangement." Abel nodded, though Abigail thought she detected a hint of disappointment in his expression. "Whatever is necessary to protect your standing in the community. The last thing I want is for you to suffer for your kindness to Dalia." "It's not just kindness, Abel," Abigail said softly. "I've grown very fond of her, and..." She hesitated, then continued, her voice barely audible. "And of you as well." Abel's head turned sharply toward her, his eyes searching her face. "Abigail!" But whatever he might have said was interrupted by Dalia stirring against his chest. "Are we home?" she mumbled sleepily. "Almost, sweetheart," Abel replied, his gaze still locked with Abigail's. "Almost home." The next few weeks established a new pattern. Abigail continued to read with Dalia at noon, but the girl was now speaking regularly in class and even making a few friends again. On Saturdays, Abigail visited the ranch, sometimes bringing small gifts for Dalia, a hair ribbon, a new book, or sweets from the mercantile. On Sundays, she joined Abel and Dalia for church services, and they often ate dinner together afterward at the hotel dining room. These public appearances had the desired effect. The townspeople's curiosity about Abigail's involvement with the Kincaids shifted from potential scandal to approval of the young teacher's dedication to her student. "You've done wonders for that child," Reverend Thomas told Abigail one Sunday after services. "And for Abel, too, I might add. It's good to see him smiling again." Abigail murmured a polite acknowledgement, but her eyes sought out Abel, who was talking with some of the other ranchers near the church steps. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up and smiled, a warm, private smile that made her heart race. It was becoming increasingly difficult to pretend that her feelings for Abel were purely friendly concern. When he helped her onto her horse, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary, or when their fingers brushed as they both reached for the same book, Abigail felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with professional interest, but she was also painfully aware of the constraints upon them. Abel was still grieving his wife, even if the sharpest edges of that grief had begun to soften. Dalia, though improving daily, was still vulnerable, and Abigail herself had her position as teacher to consider a position that required irreproachable moral conduct. In late May, nearly 2 months after Abigail had begun her Saturday visits to the ranch, an incident occurred that changed the dynamic between them irrevocably. Abigail had arrived at the ranch to find Dalia feverish and miserable, a summer cold having taken hold overnight. Abel was clearly concerned, hovering anxiously as Abigail felt the child's forehead. "It's not serious," she assured him after examining Dalia. "Just a cold. Some willow bark tea for the fever, plenty of rest, and she'll be fine in a day or two." "You're sure?" Abel pressed, his worry evident. "After Margaret, I can't help but fear the worst when she falls ill." Abigail understood his anxiety all too well. "This is nothing like what took your wife, Abel, I promise you. But if you'd prefer, I can stay today to help care for her, and we can send for the doctor if her fever hasn't broken by evening." The relief in his eyes was palpable. "Would you? I have men working the north pasture who need direction, but I didn't want to leave her." "Go," Abigail said firmly. "Dalia and I will be fine. We'll read quietly and make sure she drinks plenty of fluids." Abel clasped her hands in gratitude. "You're a blessing, Abigail Davidson. I don't know what we would have done without you these past months." After he left, Abigail made Dalia comfortable on the sofa with blankets and pillows, then brewed the willow bark tea. The girl drank it reluctantly, making faces at the bitter taste. "It will help your fever," Abigail promised. "Now, shall I read to you until you fall asleep?" Dalia nodded, her eyes already heavy. "Miss Davidson," she said, as Abigail settled into a chair beside her. "Do you like my papa?" Abigail nearly dropped the book. "Of course I like your father," she replied carefully. "He's a kind and honorable man." Dalia's fevered eyes were unnervingly direct. "No, I mean, do you like him the way Mama liked him? Because I think he likes you that way." Abigail felt her face flame. "Dalia, that's not a conversation we should be having right now. You're ill and need to rest." "I'm not that ill," Dalia protested, though her voice was weak. "And I've been thinking about it for a while. Mama wouldn't want Papa to be alone forever. She told me that once when she was sick." Abigail's heart constricted. "Your mother was very wise," she said softly. "But your father will decide when and if he's ready for that kind of companionship again. Now, let's read for a while, and then you should try to sleep." Dalia subsided, apparently satisfied with having spoken her piece, and Abigail began to read. Within minutes, the girl was asleep, her breathing congested but steady. Abigail set the book aside and moved to the kitchen to prepare a light soup for when Dalia woke. As she worked, she couldn't help but replay Dalia's words in her mind. Did Abel have feelings for her beyond gratitude and friendship? And if he did, was it too soon after Margaret's death for him to act on those feelings? She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear Abel return until he spoke from the doorway. "How is she?" Abigail started, nearly dropping the knife she was using to chop vegetables. "Better, I think. The fever hasn't risen, and she's sleeping peacefully." Abel crossed to look in on his daughter, then returned to the kitchen. "Thank you for staying with her," he said, leaning against the counter beside Abigail. "It eases my mind considerably." "It's no trouble," Abigail replied, acutely aware of his proximity. "I'm happy to help." Abel was quiet for a moment, watching her hands as she continued preparing the soup. "You're good at this," he observed. "Taking care of people." Abigail smiled slightly. "It comes with being a teacher, I suppose. Children are always getting scrapes or fevers or upset stomachs." "It's more than that," Abel said. "It's who you are, kind, patient, observant. You notice what people need before they even know they need it." The warmth in his voice made Abigail look up, and what she saw in his eyes took her breath away. There was admiration there, yes, but also something deeper, more intense. Abel, she began, not sure what she intended to say. He straightened, moving a step closer to her. Abigail, I need to tell you something, and I hope you won't think less of me for it. He took a deep breath. These past months, watching you with Dalia, getting to know you, I've begun to have feelings for you that go beyond friendship or gratitude. Abigail's heart pounded so loudly she was sure he must hear it. I have feelings for you too, she admitted softly. Relief washed over his face, followed quickly by uncertainty. Is it too soon? Margaret's only been gone 8 months. I loved her deeply, and I always will, but life continues, Abigail finished for him, and the heart doesn't always follow a proper timeline for grief. Abel nodded. Exactly. I wasn't looking for this, Abigail. I didn't expect to feel this way about anyone again, especially so soon. But being with you, it's like finding a light after walking in darkness. His words moved her deeply. I wasn't looking for this either, she confessed. I came to help Dalia, nothing more. But I've come to care for both of you more than I ever anticipated. Abel reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and touched her cheek. Where do we go from here? He asked quietly. I don't want to rush you, or to do anything that might harm your position in the community. Abigail leaned slightly into his touch. We proceed carefully, she said, for Dalia's sake as well as our own. She's still healing, and so are you. And the town gossips? He asked with a wry smile. Let them talk, Abigail replied with newfound courage. As long as we behave honorably, they'll have nothing substantial to criticize. Abel's smile widened. You're extraordinary, Abigail Davidson. Do you know that? Before she could respond, a small voice called from the other room. Papa, Miss Davidson? They moved apart quickly. Abel going to check on Dalia while Abigail turned back to the soup, her hands trembling slightly with the intensity of what had just passed between them. As she listened to Abel's gentle voice asking Dalia how she felt, Abigail realized that somehow, unexpectedly, she had found a place where she belonged, not just as a teacher or a friend, but as someone who was becoming essential to this small family's healing, and they, in turn, were becoming essential to her. The summer of 1877 unfolded with a sweetness Abigail had never known. School ended for the term in June, giving her more time to spend at the Kincaid ranch. She and Abel were careful to maintain propriety. They were never alone together without Dalia nearby, and they continued their Sunday appearances at church and the hotel dining room. But in small moments, a lingering glance across the dinner table, their hands touching as they worked side by side in Margaret's neglected garden, quiet conversations on the porch after Dalia had gone to bed, their feelings for each other deepened and strengthened. Dalia, far from being troubled by this development, seemed to flourish. Her periods of silence became increasingly rare, and her laughter could often be heard ringing through the house or across the ranch yard. She attached herself to Abigail with a fierce devotion, following her about the house, asking endless questions, and begging for stories or piano lessons. She adores you, Abel observed one evening, as they watched Dalia practice a simple tune Abigail had taught her. The feeling is mutual, Abigail replied softly. She's an extraordinary child, Abel. So resilient, so full of life despite everything she's been through. Like her mother, Abel said, and for the first time, there was no shadow in his eyes when he mentioned Margaret, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had been and what remained in their daughter. Tell me about her, Abigail asked, realizing that while Margaret's presence was everywhere in the house, they rarely spoke directly about her. Abel was quiet for a moment, collecting his thoughts. She was fearless, he finally said. I met her in Denver, where she was working as a music teacher for a wealthy family. She'd come west from Boston against her parents' wishes, determined to make her own way in the world. When I asked her to marry me and move to a half-built ranch in the middle of nowhere, she didn't hesitate. She sounds remarkable, Abigail said sincerely. She was, Abel agreed. Strong-willed, passionate about everything she loved, stubborn as the day is long. He smiled at the memory. We had some spectacular arguments, especially in the early years, but we always found our way back to each other. He looked at Abigail directly. She would have liked you, I think. You have that same inner strength, that same certainty about what matters in life. Abigail felt tears prick at her eyes. "That's the highest compliment you could pay me," she said softly. Abel reached for her hand, holding it gently. "I want you to know something, Abigail. My feelings for you don't diminish what I had with Margaret. They're different, as you and she were different. But they're just as real, just as deep." "I know," Abigail assured him, squeezing his hand. "And I would never ask you to forget her or to love her less. She'll always be a part of you, and a part of Dalia." Abel's expression was one of profound gratitude. How did I find someone who understands so perfectly? Perhaps Margaret had a hand in it, Abigail suggested with a small smile. Looking out for her family from wherever she is now. Abel's eyes widened slightly at the thought, then softened. Perhaps she did at that. In July, Abel asked Abigail if she would consider moving to the ranch permanently, not as his wife, not yet, but as a governess for Dalia. The school board had already approached Abigail about returning for the fall term, but she had been hesitant to commit, torn between her love for teaching and her growing attachment to the Kincaids. It would be entirely proper, Abel assured her. You would have your own room in the house, a salary, and formal duties educating Dalia, but it would also allow you to be here, with us, every day. What about the town school? Abigail asked, though her heart was already leaning toward accepting his offer. They'll find another teacher, Abel said. But there's only one person who can be what Dalia needs right now. And what I need, he added more softly. Abigail considered carefully. I would need to maintain some independence, she said. Perhaps teach other children from nearby ranches as well. Make it a proper small school. Abel's face lit up. You could use the old bunkhouse. My men have moved to the new one I built last year. With some work, it could be converted into a fine schoolroom. And the town gossips? Abigail asked, though with less concern than she might have once felt. Let them talk, Abel said, echoing her words from months earlier. We know our intentions are honorable. So, it was decided. Abigail gave notice to the school board and to Mrs. Hollister at the boarding house, explaining her decision as a professional advancement, the opportunity to establish a small country school serving the ranching families too far from town to attend regularly. Most accepted this explanation at face value, though Mrs. Hollister gave Abigail a knowing look. Just be careful, my dear, she advised. The heart doesn't always follow the rules society sets for it, but society has a way of punishing those who ignore its rules. I'll be careful, Abigail promised, but I can't ignore what feels right, Mrs. Hollister. Not for the sake of appearances. The older woman's expression softened. No, I don't suppose you can. You've never been one to take the easy path, have you? Well, for what it's worth, I think Abel Kincaid is a good man, and that child needs a mother's love. I hope you find happiness with them. By August, Abigail was settled at the Kincaid Ranch. The old bunkhouse had been transformed into a cheerful schoolroom, with desks salvaged from a defunct mining camp school, bookshelves Abel had built himself, and curtains Abigail had sewn from bright calico. Word had spread, and 5 children from neighboring ranches would be joining Dalia for lessons when the school term began in September. Living at the ranch brought new dimensions to Abigail's relationship with Abel. They still maintained propriety. Her bedroom was at the opposite end of the house from his, and they were careful never to be alone together behind closed doors. But they shared meals, worked side by side on ranch chores, and spent long evenings on the porch talking as Dalia played nearby or after she had gone to bed. One such evening in late August, as they watched a spectacular sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Abel turned to Abigail with unusual seriousness. There's something I've been wanting to ask you, he began, his voice low and slightly uncertain. Abigail's heart quickened. Yes? Abel took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. These past months have been the happiest I've known since Margaret died. You've brought light back into our home, hope back into our lives. Dalia adores you. And He paused, seeming to gather courage. I have fallen deeply in love with you, Abigail. I know it hasn't been a full year since Margaret's passing, and perhaps it's too soon to speak of such things, but I find I can't keep my feelings to myself any longer. Abigail felt tears gathering in her eyes. "It's not too soon, Abel, not for me." Hope blazed in his eyes. "Then, would you consider becoming my wife? Not immediately, we could wait until after the anniversary of Margaret's death if you prefer. Make it a proper mourning period. But I want you to know that's what I hope for, what I dream of. You here permanently, as my wife and Dalia's mother." "Yes," Abigail said without hesitation. "Yes, I would be honored to become your wife, Abel." And Dalia's mother. The joy that transformed his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a reverent kiss to her knuckles. "You've made me the happiest of men, Abigail Davidson. And you've made me the happiest of women, Abel Kincaid." They sat together in the gathering dusk, hands entwined, hearts full, watching as the first stars appeared in the velvet sky. Neither felt the need for further words in that moment of perfect understanding. Later, they would tell Dalia their news, watching her face light up with joy as she threw her arms around both of them. Later, they would face the reactions of the townspeople most supportive, some disapproving of the somewhat hasty courtship. Later, they would plan a simple wedding ceremony for November, after the proper year of mourning had passed. But in that moment on the porch, with the day's last light gilding the landscape and the promise of tomorrow stretching before them, Abigail and Abel were content simply to be together, joined by love that had grown from the seeds of compassion, flowering in the most unexpected of circumstances. The first frosts of autumn were painting the meadows silver when Abigail and Abel were married in a simple ceremony at the ranch. Dalia, radiant in a new dress of blue calico, stood beside them, her hand clasped firmly in Abigail's throughout the service. Reverend Thomas, who had watched their relationship blossom over the months, spoke not of replacing what was lost, but of building anew, of love's capacity to heal and grow, even in the wake of grief. Abel's voice was steady as he promised to cherish Abigail all the days of his life, and Abigail's eyes shone with happy tears as she pledged herself to both father and daughter. After the ceremony, as friends from town and neighboring ranches celebrated with them, Abel led Abigail aside for a moment of privacy. From his pocket, he withdrew a small, worn book, Margaret's volume of Wordsworth poetry. "I want you to have this," he said, placing it in Abigail's hands. "Margaret's notes, her thoughts. They're part of our family story, a story that now includes you." Abigail's throat tightened with emotion. "Are you certain? This is so precious to you and Dalia." "We're certain," Abel assured her, and Abigail turned to see Dalia standing beside them, nodding her agreement. "We talked about it, Dalia and I. Margaret would want you to have something of hers, something to welcome you into the family she loves so much." "Thank you," Abigail whispered, holding the book close to her heart. "I'll treasure it always." Dalia stepped forward then, taking both their hands in hers. "Papa says that family isn't just about blood," she said, with the simple wisdom of childhood. "It's about who you choose to love. And we choose you, Miss Davidson, Mama." The words, so simple, so profound, brought fresh tears to Abigail's eyes. She knelt to embrace Dalia, feeling Abel's hand come to rest on her shoulder. In that moment, surrounded by the love of her new family, Abigail knew that she had found her true home, not in a place, but in the hearts of those who had chosen her, just as she had chosen them. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the land that was now her home, Abigail Davidson Kincaid offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought her here, a journey that had begun with a silent, grieving child and a father at his wit's end, a journey of patience and kindness and reading at noon hour, a journey that had led, improbably but perfectly, to love.